Should you buy the dip in Coinbase stock? We'll talk about that and more on today's show. What is going on, investors? Hopefully you guys are doing well out there. It is time to talk about Coinbase global stock, ticker symbol COIN. Now, the company just reported their Q3 earnings. We are going to get into them. We'll take a look at the revenue, the profit, everything that I think you need to know about Coinbase. And then we got to look at this from a technical perspective. Hello, drop off a cliff. This stock was up over $368 per share earlier today, and now we've crashed down by about 10% in the after hours after reporting these Q3 numbers. Stock's currently trading right now at about $320 per share. Full disclosure, I own a couple of shares of this down at about $280, $290 per share. I didn't catch this trailing stop, and so I am losing money in the after hours. We'll talk about if I am going to buy the dip on this one, okay? I don't own a very large portfolio of stocks, and I certainly don't jump in on early IPO stocks very often, but I tell you what, this stock has a $71 billion valuation and a forward PE, I'm going to say only of 26, because when you look across the market, a 26 forward PE on a company that just printed 315% revenue growth year over year is pretty darn hard to find. In fact, I doubt there's a stock out there that you could compare to Coinbase on that basis. Now, the revenue growth over at Coinbase, which we talked about, came in at about $1.3 billion. That is up over 300% over the last year. I don't necessarily think that is the full story. We're going to talk about these expenses here in a moment, but before I wanted to do that, I wanted to just show you some broader things that I think the market is starting to digest just a little bit. We have our net revenue coming down here. It's at $1.2 billion. I don't know why it's listed here at $1.2 billion. My guess is it's coming off this net revenue side. They had some other revenue coming in at $77 million. That gets us to total revenues over at Coinbase at $1.3 billion. But this is really probably just your bread and butter crypto revenue. That came in at $1.2 billion in the quarter. We talked about how that was up just massive, like over 315% over the last year. We were sitting at just $286 million worth of net revenue. That ticked up basically $1 billion to $1.23 billion. But what I think investors are starting to digest is take a look at this. Over the last three quarters, in quarter one, we had $1.6 billion worth of revenue. That ticked all the way up to $2 billion worth of revenue. And now we're all the way back down at $1.2 billion worth of revenue. Has me concerned to a certain degree. But then what I wanted to look at is see if people are pulling their money off of Coinbase. That would have me like really concerned. Okay. But we see here assets on the platform. Retail investors have 116 billion. That's up from the previous quarter and basically the highest on record that we have here. And institutional clients, which makes up the bulk of how Coinbase makes money, at least at the current time, they still have $139 billion worth of assets. That is still at a high, at least what we have here on record. And I'm sure it's likely an all-time high for the company. So people are not necessarily pulling their money off of Coinbase. It could be that they're just sitting on their coins and not trading them back and forth quite as much as they maybe did in Q2 and Q1. And that's what generates fees for Coinbase. So I noticed that. The other thing that is really stands out when we get to these numbers is they've disintegrated a little bit from an operating profit perspective. We'll talk about that here in a second. So we have our net revenues. Those came in at $1.3 billion. We talked about how that's literally $1 billion over where you were last year. Again, find a lot of companies with a forward PE in the 20s that are growing their year over year revenue growth by 300%. That is why I stepped in on this one. And it's a rare thing to do if you've been following me on this channel for any length of time. Now, we went up big time in our revenues, but what also went up big time is our operating expenses. Now, some of it is based to stock-based compensation. This company more recently went public, and certainly compared to last year, they're likely rewarding their employees and their executives more and more in stock, considering it's one way to kind of keep cash flow inside the business. But we had a $264 million worth of stock-based compensation in the period, but we still had total operating expenses coming in north of $1 billion. Ooh, my goodness, that is a big increase considering last year on a quarterly basis, you were sitting at $213 million. So that gives us operating income in the most recent period. I tell you what, I still like what we've got going on over here at Coinbase. Okay, look at our operating income last year, $101 million. I know off $315 million worth of total revenue, you cleared a third of that basically to this operating side. Now, that's not quite as good as what we've seen in the past. We cleared this $1.3 billion worth of revenue. Now, we didn't clear quite a third of it down here to the bottom line, but we still tripled our operating income, because take a look at this. We tripled our revenue. We didn't nail it on the head, but this is almost a triple to go from 101 million up to $291 million over at Coinbase. So I like what I'm seeing there in terms of operating income growing in relation to revenue almost in a lockstep. That's what I love about this company, the fact that they have the strong revenue growth combined with a profitable operating perspective as well. Now, this company has a massive, I'm talking about a massive amount of cash sitting on the balance sheet right now at $6.3 billion. They have these customer funds sitting here on the asset side. They balance it off as a liability down here. You could basically write those numbers out if you felt like it. All things being considered, Coinbase is tremendously well capitalized, okay? When you analyze this company from a cash flow perspective, it's really awkward, and I would not analyze this company from a cash flow perspective because number one, you get to add back in massive stock-based compensation over the last year. You get to add back in big-time impairment expenses. That might make a little sense, but you get to add back in custodial funds that are due to customers at $4.9 billion. That gives you $7 billion worth of cash flow over the 9 months when your net income was $2.7 billion. It just simply doesn't make a lot of sense to analyze this. And that's why when we look at bank stocks, cash flows really isn't necessarily a part of how we analyze that. But I did want to show you here on the financing side, this company did issue a senior note at about $2 billion. They did a convertible note at about $1.4 billion. This is where the vast majority of that cash came on the balance sheet, because I talked about how in 9 months ended last year, you had about $2.6 billion worth of cash. Now you got $15 billion worth of cash. I think some of that actually includes customer custodial funds. I would really just look at here, cash and cash equivalents, $6.3 billion. That's way over where we were at the start of the year. This company is well capitalized. It is profitable. It is in a very, very hot niche like the cryptocurrency market, but unfortunately, we're seeing the stock trade off in the after hours by about 8%. And I say unfortunately, it's not really that big of a deal. I tell you what, I'd like to get these shares on a discount. Now, unfortunately, the stock did just recently go public earlier this year, and we don't have a lot of price action on this one. I would likely say in the intermediate term, the bottom is pretty much in on Coinbase between the bottom really is 213. We could revisit that area. I think Coinbase's business model and cryptocurrency in general would have to disintegrate a little bit. Maybe it's through federal regulations. Maybe it's through other regulations in other countries that take away the right or maybe the privilege of buying cryptocurrency with your own currency. So I could see that hurting, and that's certainly your long-term risk with a Coinbase, is that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are kind of regulated to death, and it basically kills Coinbase's business model. That's why if you're an investor in this one, I would size it accordingly. Me personally, I have way more Visa, way more MasterCard, way more Bank of America, JP Morgan. In terms of financial services, that's where I like to be. I'll catch a little bit of upside in like fintech and upstart fintech with Coinbase and maybe a few other stocks, maybe like a Square or a PayPal, for example. So I would size your investment in a stock like this accordingly. We could pull back down here to this $300 range. That is only $23 lower than where the stock is trading in the after hours. At this $300 range, that has acted as a level of support. I tell you what, if it comes all the way back down to about $280 on this one, I will certainly reassess if I need to reload at that level as well. Me personally, I think I'm well capitalized with Coinbase. I like this stock going forward. It's probably one of the few recently IPO'd companies that I would actually endorse starting a position on based on the valuation, based on the fact that they're generating massive operating income. And I think you have a lot of upside if we can continue to see volatility in crypto, which is pretty much a given based on how crypto has traded in the past. The more volatility you have up and down, the more money a company like Coinbase will make. That was Coinbase stock. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. We'll be back again soon with more. Good luck with your investments.